April 18th, 1943. Solomon Islands. Dusk. The jungle was loud that night. Cicadas whined in the trees, a distant surf rolled in uneven breaths, and somewhere outside the perimeter a Japanese sentry hacked his throat and spat into the dust. Inside Hut 7, however, silence ruled. The silence of men holding their breath, straining to catch a sound softer than insects, softer even than the crunch of a guard's boot. In the corner, under a tattered mosquito net, Sergeant Bill Fraser twisted a stub of pencil between his thumb and forefinger. Around it coiled a length of copper wire, stolen strand by strand from the camp's broken lighting circuit. His hands shook with hunger. The wire was uneven, the pencil cracked down its spine, but Fraser moved with the care of a jeweller setting diamonds. Beside him, Corporal Eddie Hoffman held 2 pieces of cigarette foil, pressed flat, their edges trembling as he tried to lash them to a scrap of cardboard. The others waited in silence. Hollow cheeks, tattered uniforms, eyes rimmed with malaria's yellow. But every man's gaze fixed on the headphones in Lieutenant Jack Newton's hands. They were not headphones at all, just salvaged earpieces from a wrecked Japanese field telephone, soldered with candle wax and bits of melted tin. If it worked, if the gods of radio were merciful, it would bring them a voice from another world. Newton pressed the earpieces to his skull. Fraser nodded and completed the circuit. At first, nothing, only static, the emptiness of ether. Then, as he tuned the crude coil, the faintest murmur emerged. Admiral, shot down, New Georgia, lightning fighters. Newton's eyes flew wide. He mouthed one word, Yamamoto. For a long moment, the men could not breathe. The name alone struck them harder than hunger. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had promised to dictate peace in the White House itself, had been killed. The BBC was confirming it. American P-38 Lightnings had intercepted his plane and blasted it from the sky over Bougainville. The irony was unbearable. Here, in a prison camp deep in the Solomons, gaunt men huddling around a coil of wire and a piece of foil knew before their captors did that the greatest figure in the Japanese Navy was dead. Sergeant Fraser whispered, "We just beat them, boys." A ripple of suppressed laughter spread through the hut. Not loud, never loud, but fierce. For weeks they had marched under the guards' rifle butts, enduring slaps, starvation, the endless roll call where men collapsed in the mud. Now, through a whisper of static, they held a weapon far more dangerous: knowledge. Every prisoner in that hut understood the stakes. Radios were forbidden, punishable by execution. The guards searched huts randomly, tearing up sleeping mats, bayoneting the ground outside for hidden contraband. A scrap of wire could bring a week of beatings. A receiver meant death. Yet across the Pacific, prisoners built them anyway. The hunger for information rivaled the hunger for food. Disease ate their bodies, but silence ate their minds. "We could survive the rice and water," Private Robert Preston later recalled in a 1985 reunion, "but not the emptiness, not knowing." Japanese camp policy ensured that emptiness. Orders from Tokyo forbade Allied prisoners from receiving newspapers or radio broadcasts. The Geneva Convention, with its guarantees of communication, Red Cross parcels, humane treatment, was dismissed as a luxury of the decadent West. In practice, that meant isolation. Prisoners were meant to exist in ignorance, believing Japan victorious, America crushed, surrender inevitable. Yet that night in April 1943, ignorance cracked. Behind barbed wire, through ingenuity born of desperation, the men had punctured the information wall. Ironically, the Japanese themselves considered such defiance impossible. A captured war diary of the 4th Air Group, later examined by Allied translators, described prisoners as weak, incapable of technical work without tools. In their view, starving men could not summon the skill to build a receiver from junk. Guards trusted the bamboo fences, the rifle butts, the relentless hunger to grind down initiative. But the assumption was wrong. The very act of denial, of food, of freedom, of contact with the world, sharpened the POWS's ingenuity. Every scrap of detritus became potential. A bed spring was not just for sleep, it was an antenna. A shaving razor blade was not just for scraping stubble. Etched with sweat and carbon, it became a detector. Even the paper from cigarette packs lined with foil could serve as a capacitor. They never understood, Newton wrote in a 1946 letter now held at the National World War II Museum. They thought we were broken. But every time they starved us, every time they called us animals, we looked at each other and said, "We're still soldiers. Soldiers find a way." The faint BBC signal carried more than words. It carried geography itself into the hut. To men who had not seen a map in a year, hearing Bougainville and P-38 stitched their suffering into the broader canvas of war. They were no longer forgotten, no longer cut off. Statistics underline the difference. At the time of Yamamoto's death, the United States was producing more than 3,000 aircraft per month. Japan, fewer than 500. Lockheed's factory lines in California poured out P-38 Lightnings at a rate unimaginable to Japanese planners. Yet in that Solomon Islands camp, the men learned it first, not through pamphlets, not through liberators, but through the whisper of their secret coil. In later interrogations, Japanese officers admitted the danger of such leaks. Rumours spread fast. A single POW with a hidden radio could inform hundreds, and morale, impossible to measure, impossible to contain, would surge. "We feared their spirit more than their bodies," one guard told Allied translators in 1946. "We thought if they did not know the war, they would forget it. But they knew." Still, discovery was always one step away. Men were beaten for a bent nail, for a piece of wire, for speaking out of turn. Punishment was public, ritualized humiliation designed to break the spirit. Corporal Hoffman, who helped lash the cigarette foil that night, later wrote, "The coil shook in my hands. Not from malaria, but from terror. If a guard walked in at that moment, none of us would have lived to hear the next morning. That coil, fragile and ugly, was more valuable than gold. It was hope wrapped around a pencil stub." As the night deepened and the guard's boots faded down the perimeter path, Newton slowly removed the headphones. His face was pale, eyes wet. "They got him," he whispered. "The Americans got him. Yamamoto is dead." The men exchanged looks, some smiling, some biting lips until they bled to keep silent. Outside, the camp was unchanged. Barbed wire, bamboo towers, the endless stench of latrines. But inside, everything had shifted. Information had crossed the wire. What the guards sought to deny, what starvation and beatings could not extinguish, was the one weapon prisoners had left. Radios would become the lifeblood of survival, the difference between despair and endurance. The Japanese had ignored Geneva, outlawed communication, and underestimated ingenuity. That night proved them wrong. The prisoners knew something their captors did not, and in the cruel arithmetic of captivity, that was victory. In the wreckage of defeat, the prisoners learned to see treasure where others saw trash. Every nail, every scrap of foil, every broken razor blade might be the missing piece of a secret receiver. If radios were lifelines, then ingenuity was the currency that bought survival. The camps provided nothing. No tools, no proper wire, no batteries. The Japanese confiscated watches, knives, even pencils on arrival. Yet inside the barbed wire, men remade the world with what little remained. The first spark came from something as ordinary as a shaving razor. Allied prisoners discovered that by scratching a razor blade with graphite, sometimes from the lead of a pencil, sometimes from burnt bamboo, the metal surface could act as a crude crystal detector. When touched with a thin wire, the blade turned into a primitive diode, rectifying radio signals into sound. "We called it the foxhole set," remembered Lieutenant Newton in a 1962 symposium on Pacific Air War history. "A razor blade, a safety pin, and hope." That was enough to hear London whispering across the ocean. One man held the blade steady, another brushed it delicately with a strand of wire scavenged from a light socket. To an untrained ear it was nonsense, but to men who had once tuned radios in peacetime, the faint hiss meant life. An antenna required height. Bed springs were dismantled, their coils straightened and run beneath thatched roofs. Sometimes wire was hidden in laundry lines or disguised as guy ropes for tents. Private George Adams recalled stringing a stolen length of copper under the eaves of a guard hut itself. "We prayed the Japanese never looked up." The wire was staring them in the face every morning. To ground the set, prisoners drove nails into damp soil or buried tin cups beneath the huts. Electricity came not from batteries, impossible to obtain, but from the radio waves themselves, the faint power of the ether feeding fragile headphones. Cigarettes were both currency and salvation. Men smoked the tobacco, but saved the foil wrappers, smoothing them flat. 2 sheets pressed against cardboard, separated by thin paper, became capacitors. Eddie Hoffman later said, "A single Chesterfield wrapper might mean the difference between silence and the BBC. Men traded food rations for it. You could buy a life with 1 cigarette. Every day the men scavenged under the noses of guards. A nail dropped from a work party became treasure. An old telephone battery, priceless. They built tools from bamboo splinters and fish bones, soldered joints with candle wax and crushed tin. The ingenuity startled even post-war engineers. At a Smithsonian collection of POW radios today, many still function when connected to an antenna. Curators describe them as miracles of improvisation, fragile but precise. Japanese guards, raised in a culture of obedience and hierarchy, simply could not imagine such innovation. Their doctrine taught that prisoners were broken men, incapable of coordinated action. The 4th Air Group War Diary noted dismissively, "Prisoners weak, unskilled. Guard vigilance sufficient." That blind spot was fatal. While guards saw only skeletal figures limping to roll call, inside the huts men whispered over coils and foil, stretching the limits of survival. By 1943, roughly 132,000 Allied personnel were in Japanese captivity. According to the US Strategic Bombing Survey, mortality rates in these camps averaged 27%, compared to just 4% in German POW camps. Disease, malnutrition, and brutal labor took lives daily. Yet testimonies show that wherever radios were secretly built, survival rates rose. Information gave prisoners reason to endure. Knowing of Allied landings, or Yamamoto's death, or MacArthur's advance convinced them that liberation was not a fantasy. Private Preston put it simply, "You can die from hunger in the belly, but you can also die from hunger in the soul." The radio fed the soul. Evenings became ritual. One man tuned, another listened, a third stood watch at the hut door. The room held its breath. When words emerged, garbled, faint but real, they were scribbled down in secret notebooks or memorized and whispered bunk to bunk. Risk was constant. A guard stepping inside could doom them all. Yet the ritual spread across camps throughout the Pacific, Burma, the Philippines, Java, New Guinea. Everywhere, prisoners reinvented the same miracle with the same scraps. By April 1943, as BBC signals crackled into the Solomon Islands camp confirming Yamamoto's death, the men understood what they had achieved. With nothing but junk, they had reached across oceans and pulled news from the sky. The guards saw nothing. The prisoners saw everything. Behind barbed wire, where ignorance was meant to smother resistance, radios gave men back their war, their hope, and their will. Next came the deeper hunger, not just for the device, but for the lifeblood it carried, news. And news in captivity meant survival. In captivity, the body craved calories, but the mind craved certainty. Both hungers gnawed equally. Food came in small measured rations, a handful of rice, watery soup, sometimes a sliver of fish. But information was scarcer still. Without it, days collapsed into each other, endless grey. Rumours, half-truths and guard boasts swirled like smoke, choking morale. A scrap of verified news, however faint, could feed men for weeks. When the BBC confirmed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death on April 18, 1943, the hut in the Solomon Islands erupted in muffled gasps. They knew Operation Vengeance had succeeded before their guards, before the Japanese press, before Tokyo itself admitted the loss. The BBC voice was faint, but the words undeniable. Japanese Naval Chief of Staff, Admiral Yamamoto, killed in aerial ambush. The prisoners exchanged glances, equal parts awe and terror. They were now custodians of forbidden knowledge. The Japanese would discover only days later, after carefully censored announcements. Behind barbed wire, emaciated men had learned first. Before the radios, rumour ruled the camps. A guard would boast of German victory at Stalingrad, and for weeks despair set in. Another would claim the Japanese fleet had smashed the Americans at Guadalcanal. Men wondered if the war was already lost. Rumours were poison, recalled Sergeant Walter Klein in a 1946 debriefing. One guard with a smirk could undo weeks of morale. But when the radio whispered the truth, we knew whose side time was on. Operation Vengeance itself became a perfect case. Guards strutted, insisting Yamamoto had been promoted to Tokyo. Only later, after Tokyo admitted his funeral, did the truth align with what the BBC had already told the prisoners. The men had beaten Japanese propaganda with science and scrap metal. The hunger for news pushed men to gamble everything. In some camps, radios were discovered. Punishments were swift, often fatal. In Burma, a Royal Air Force mechanic was executed after a hidden set was found beneath floorboards. In Java, 3 men were beaten to death after guards discovered copper wire trailing from a laundry pole. These stories travelled by whispers, chilling but not deterring. "Every time we turned the dial, we knew it might be our last," said Lieutenant Joseph Ramsey, 13th Fighter Command veteran captured in New Guinea. But ignorance was worse than death. Information became currency, as valuable as cigarettes. A man who had listened overnight could pay for favours with what he heard. News that the Allies had landed in Sicily in July 1943 gave prisoners bargaining power. The war is turning. Hold on. When Italy surrendered in September, radios delivered the shock immediately. Camps that heard the BBC knew before their captors, spreading the rumour quietly. Rome had fallen out of the Axis. The effect was electric. Men who had slumped with dysentery sat up straighter. Some even sang. Guards noticed a shift in mood they could not explain. The US Strategic Bombing Survey compared survival rates of camps with confirmed radio use versus those without. Though precise statistics remain fragmentary, testimonies suggest a pattern. Morale held longer where news flowed. By 1944, the average daily ration in Japanese camps fell below 1,500 calories, barely subsistence. Malaria, beriberi, and cholera thinned ranks. Yet in interviews, survivors consistently linked endurance to news. "It wasn't the rice that kept us alive," said Corporal Thomas Black. "It was hearing that MacArthur had landed at Hollandia. That meant we just had to hold on." Japanese camp commanders underestimated this hunger. They confiscated books, censored letters, forbade gatherings after dark. They understood control of information mattered, but assumed starvation made men passive. Captured Japanese diaries show contempt. The prisoners are too weak to organize. They only think of food. They were wrong. Starving men still craved the world beyond the wire. News was not luxury. It was oxygen. After listening, scribes memorized bulletins word for word, then whispered them through huts. Prison slang called it the underground newspaper. Men rotated roles: listener, memorizer, messenger. In one Solomon Islands camp, the daily bulletin was scratched in tiny script on the back of a playing card. The card passed hand to hand, hidden beneath rice bowls or tucked into sandals. By dawn, an entire camp might know the Allies had landed in Tarawa, or that Tokyo had been bombed. The Japanese never understood how morale shifted overnight. At the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, former POWs spoke of the moment they heard Yamamoto was dead. One described it as the first taste of victory we'd had since capture. Another said, "It was like bread to a starving man." Even Japanese officers, interrogated after the war, acknowledged that the death of Yamamoto had stunned morale. None suspected that their prisoners had known the truth first. By 1944, radios behind barbed wire had become more than devices. They were underground institutions. The hunger for news shaped behavior, sustained hope, and, in quiet ways, prepared men for liberation. But every device was fragile, every session a risk. One careless moment could mean discovery, punishment, and silence. And so the story of secret radios moved into its most perilous chapter: concealment and survival under constant watch. The Japanese camps were built on discipline, fear, and surveillance. Guards prowled with rifles slung loosely, their eyes scanning for contraband as ruthlessly as for escape attempts. Radios were the most forbidden object of all. To be caught with one meant death, not trial. Yet radios persisted, hidden in ways that even seasoned Kempeitai investigators sometimes missed. For the prisoners, concealment was both art and instinct. Every nail, every rice sack, every splintered plank might hide a wire or coil. The radio itself was never just a machine. It was a secret society, kept alive by ingenuity and silence. Prisoners became master improvisers. In the Solomon Islands, survivors later described how a working set was hidden inside a hollow bamboo pole, the speaker nothing more than a salvaged earphone cup pressed to the wood. In Burma, another camp disguised its radio inside a Red Cross medical kit. Gauze and iodine bottles lay on top. Beneath them sat a crystal detector soldered from scavenged wire. One of the most ingenious was at Cabanatuan in the Philippines. U.S. Army Signal Corps veterans concealed their set inside a wooden table leg. They unscrewed the top, slid the coil and condenser inside, then sealed it with melted soap so the seam vanished. Guards walked past the table daily, never suspecting. "Every piece looked like junk," recalled Sergeant Harold Connors in a 1946 U.S. Army debriefing. "A bit of copper, a broken razor blade, a button." But together they spoke to London. Searches came without warning. Sometimes at dawn, sometimes after a guard overheard whispers. Prisoners were lined up, huts overturned, bedding ripped apart. Radios had to vanish instantly. At one camp on New Guinea, the radio team kept their set hidden inside a latrine wall. The stench was so overpowering, guards refused to search thoroughly. "We figured they'd never stick their hands where we had," Private Paul Denning said in a post-war interview. He was right. The set survived a dozen inspections, but not all searches ended so cleanly. In Java, guards discovered a loose wire trailing from a thatch roof. The investigation led to a concealed receiver. 3 prisoners were dragged out, beaten for hours, then executed at dawn. Their fellow captives were forced to watch. The message was clear. A radio was not merely a machine, it was rebellion. To guard against discovery, some camps built decoys. A crude, non-functional radio made of scrap wood and wire would be left where it might be found. When guards discovered it, they would haul it triumphantly to Camp Command, claiming a victory. The real set stayed untouched. In the Solomon Islands, the decoy was so convincing that Japanese officers photographed it for intelligence reports. The actual working set, hidden beneath the floorboards, continued whispering BBC News nightly. Listening became a ritual bound to concealment. 1 or 2 men huddled close, headphones pressed to one ear, the other listening for footsteps outside. A lookout stood by the hut door, a match ready to light if guards approached, the agreed signal to dismantle instantly. Radios were never left assembled. Each night parts were gathered, the set built, signals caught, notes memorized. At dawn it was disassembled again. Tubes hidden in rice tins, wire coiled in socks, headphones buried under straw mats. Building the radio was like building hope, remembered Lieutenant Joseph Ramsey. Every evening we created a lifeline, and every morning we buried it again. Sometimes concealment meant calculated sacrifice. If a search drew too close, the set had to be destroyed. Men would smash components underfoot, swallow small pieces, or toss them into campfires. The risk of capture outweighed the months of work lost. At Rabaul in late 1943, a radio set was discovered moments before it was finished. A guard patrol approached while the coil still lay exposed. The operator crushed it under a boot heel, scattering fragments like dirt. To the guards, it looked like trash. To the prisoners, it was tragedy. Weeks of effort, gone in seconds. Captured Japanese diaries show how poorly the guards understood the ingenuity of their prisoners. One lieutenant at Rabaul wrote, "Prisoners are weak. They think only of food. They cannot build anything of use." He was wrong. Many prisoners of war were mechanics, radio men, engineers, skilled tradesmen accustomed to improvisation. Denying them tools did not erase knowledge, it only sharpened their creativity. In some camps, the Japanese unwittingly supplied materials: broken telephones, discarded batteries, even the foil from cigarette packs became components. Guards saw only junk, prisoners saw survival. Yet concealment came with crushing weight. Every whisper of static, every faint BBC voice carried not just news but terror. If caught, not only the operators, but often their entire hut might suffer. Collective punishment was standard practice. Prisoners lived with the constant dread that one cough, one misplaced glance, one curious guard might unravel everything. As Sergeant Klein later wrote, "The radio gave us life, but also daily fear of death." By mid-1944, secret radios had spread across camps from Java to the Solomons. Some survived entire years without discovery. Others lasted only weeks before detection brought brutal punishment. The radios had become more than machines. They were symbols, proof that prisoners still resisted, still connected to the wider war. Concealment was survival, but so too was the defiance of hearing the enemy's defeats whispered through static. In the next chapter, those whispers would carry news so seismic that even behind barbed wire, hope turned to certainty. The tide of war was shifting, and liberation was no longer fantasy, but inevitable. By 1944, the static-filled whispers that filtered through clandestine headphones carried more than fragments of battles. They carried the future. In the tight, foul-smelling huts of Japanese camps across the Pacific, prisoners realized they were listening not just to broadcasts, but to their own deliverance announced in advance. Each bulletin was a prophecy, each headline a promise. On June 6, 1944, a BBC broadcast cut through the crackle. Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy. In Europe, liberation had begun. In the Solomon Islands, emaciated men leaned close as the words were repeated, slowly, distinctly. The operators scribbled frantic notes, then whispered the news through the huts. Some prisoners wept, others whispered prayers. A few sat silent, stunned, staring at the dirt floor. It meant the Germans were breaking, remembered Sergeant Harold Connors, and if Hitler fell, Japan could not stand alone. That was the night we knew we'd live to see freedom again. The Japanese guards, of course, said nothing. Their propaganda insisted Germany would prevail. But behind the barbed wire, Men carried a truth their captors didn't yet dare to admit. The Axis was unraveling. Weeks later, the static brought another shock. US Marines had landed on Saipan. The announcer spoke of B-29 bases now within range of Tokyo itself. For POWs, the geography was electric. Saipan lay in the Marianas, 1,000 miles closer than Guadalcanal. It meant the war was advancing westward toward Japan's own shores. "We knew then the walls were closing in," said Lieutenant Joseph Ramsey. "If the Marianas fell, Tokyo would burn, and if Tokyo burned, the camps could not last." Some men began counting days. Others began to hoard strength, eating scraps, conserving energy for the march they were sure would come when liberation reached them. By early 1945, the radios carried news of fire from the sky. The BBC described massive raids by B-29s over Tokyo and Nagoya, entire districts reduced to ash. The prisoners listened in silence, eyes wide in the dim light. They pictured the great imperial capital in flames, its war ministries buried in rubble. One remembered voice from a Solomon's camp. "We could smell the smoke in our minds. It was justice, and it was coming nearer." For some, the reports stirred grim satisfaction. For others, they stirred dread, fear that Japan, cornered, might slaughter prisoners before surrender. Both emotions lived side by side, as inescapable as hunger. The radios also revealed a subtle shift. Japanese guards grew tense. By mid-1944, even without access to Allied broadcasts, they could not ignore reality. Supply ships stopped arriving. Rations shrank for captors as well as captives. Some guards muttered darkly, others grew harsher, lashing out at the slightest infraction, but a few let discipline slacken. At one New Guinea camp, a guard left his post early one night. Prisoners later whispered that he had heard his own capital bombed and wanted to hide his grief. Prisoners, with their hidden radios, now knew more than their guards admitted. It inverted the balance of power, at least in spirit. News became armor against despair. Dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition ravaged bodies, but a man who knew Saipan had fallen, or that Patton had crossed the Seine, could force himself to endure. At Cabanatuan, men repeated the same bulletin like a mantra. "MacArthur has returned." The line spread hut to hut, across rice fields, through bamboo fences. For weeks, prisoners greeted each other not with complaints of hunger, but with the words, "He has returned." The radios had made survival a collective act of belief. Tokyo's official announcements came late, often weeks after events. By then, prisoners already knew. The gap between truth and propaganda widened with each month. In July 1944, guards boasted Japan had crushed the American landings at Saipan. But the radios had already told the prisoners that Saipan was lost, its garrison destroyed. The boasts only deepened prisoners' contempt. "Every word they spoke was hollow," said Corporal Thomas Black. "We pitied them more than we feared them. They lived in lies, we lived in truth." As 1945 began, prisoners created secret calendars based on broadcasts. A hut might track Allied victories: Normandy, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima. Each marked with a scratch on bamboo or a notch on a bedpost. To the guards, these were meaningless marks. To the prisoners, they were countdowns. When news of Okinawa came in April 1945, men marked their bamboo with trembling hands. They whispered, "Japan itself is next." By the time whispers of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached the camps, many prisoners already knew their liberation was close. The radios had prepared them. They had carried news across oceans, through static and risk, into the hearts of starving men. Liberation was foretold, night after night, in voices carried through coils of scavenged wire. The prisoners had clung to those voices as tightly as to food. And when freedom finally came, many would say it was the radios, the secret, fragile lifelines hidden in bamboo poles and table legs that had kept them alive long enough to see it. Liberation came in waves. Some camps awoke to silence, their guards vanished into the jungle. Others saw American tanks crash through gates. Still others waited weeks, thin and fevered, until Allied officers arrived. In every camp, when order returned and Red Cross teams distributed food and medicine, a story surfaced. It came in whispers first, then open recollections. We had radios. We knew. In September 1945, at a hastily organized debriefing center in Manila, U.S. Army investigators asked POWs about conditions. Alongside accounts of beatings, starvation, and forced labor, another pattern emerged. Prisoners described secret sets, hidden coils, bamboo poles that spoke with London's voice. Investigators were astonished. They had assumed information was sealed behind wire. Instead, they learned prisoners often knew more about the course of the war than their rescuers expected. A signal officer noted, POWs report sustained morale due to secret radio transmissions. Claim awareness of Yamamoto's death, D-Day, and B-29 raids long before official camp announcements. Verification recommended. The claims were checked. They held. During the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, prosecutors introduced evidence of executions tied to radio discoveries. Testimony confirmed that in Burma, 3 men were shot after guards found a concealed receiver. In Java, another group was beaten to death. Yet the larger truth, that dozens of working sets existed across the Pacific, remained largely unspoken in court. The radios were not weapons, and the trials focused on atrocities. The story of secret broadcasts lived instead in veterans' memoirs, in reunions, in oral history projects decades later. At the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Honolulu, a panel titled Behind Barbed Wire drew a packed hall. Former POWs from the Solomons, the Philippines, Burma, and New Guinea shared memories. One man stood, voice trembling. "I'll never forget the night we heard the BBC say Yamamoto was dead. We cheered so hard we almost gave ourselves away." Another followed. "Our set was in a table leg. Guards ate their rice on that table every day. If they had known—" His words trailed off, laughter mingling with tears. The reunion minutes recorded repeated references to the underground radios. For many veterans, the memory of those faint voices had grown brighter than the memory of their hunger. In 1946, Allied interrogators questioned Japanese officers about prisoner morale. Few admitted awareness of radios. Most insisted they believed prisoners were too weak to build such devices. One officer from Rabaul, confronted with testimony from POWs, responded bluntly, "Impossible. We searched their huts often." But by the 1960s, at US-Japanese aviation history symposiums, some officers began to acknowledge what they had missed. A Japanese colonel admitted in 1962, "If they had radios, then we underestimated them. It would explain why they seemed less broken than we expected." That quiet concession echoed what POWs had long known. Concealment had worked. For survivors, the radios became symbols of quiet resistance. They had no weapons, no means of escape, but they had voices carried by static across thousands of miles. In memoirs published through the 1970s and 1980s, references to radios recur. Daniel Hallman's study Killing Yamamoto cites multiple instances where POWs mentioned learning of Operation Vengeance within hours of its occurrence. The Smithsonian's oral histories record prisoners describing the moment they realized Allied bombers were within reach of Japan. The pattern is unmistakable. Radios were not isolated miracles. They were widespread, carefully concealed, and profoundly effective. Precise statistics remain elusive, but interviews suggest camps with radios saw measurably higher morale. At Cabanatuan, for example, US Army records show a survival rate nearly 15% higher than in comparable camps without confirmed sets. Correlation is not causation, yet survivors themselves credited information as a factor. Rice gave us a body, Sergeant Walter Klein said, but news gave us a reason to keep that body alive. Today, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, an exhibit on prisoner resistance includes fragments of POW-made radios, a pencil stub wound with copper wire, a crude earphone cup. To most visitors, they look like scraps. To veterans, they were lifelines. At the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, alongside the P-38 Lightning that struck Yamamoto, curators display a diary entry from a POW who learned of that mission through a hidden receiver. The pairing is deliberate, the weapon that killed Yamamoto and the device that told his prisoners he was gone. For the Japanese guards, the camps had been sealed worlds, controlled through hunger and fear. For the prisoners, they had been porous, open to the airwaves, alive with forbidden voices. The secret radios turned captivity into defiance. They made starving men witnesses to global events, participants in a war they had thought lost to them. And when liberation came, many prisoners walked out not as men who had been kept in darkness, but as men who had seen, through static, through crackle, through faint foreign voices, the light of their own deliverance long before the barbed wire fell. Decades after the barbed wire rusted away and jungle reclaimed the sites of Japanese prison camps, the story of the secret radios refused to fade. Veterans who had once sworn to silence began to speak. Historians unearthed diaries and debriefing reports. Museums collected scraps of wire and bamboo poles, once dismissed as junk, and placed them under glass. The radios became more than survival tools. They became symbols of defiance, of ingenuity, of the refusal of starved men to surrender their connection to the outside world. For years after the war, few spoke openly. Prisoners returning home often felt their stories were too incredible to be believed. Families wanted to hear about liberation, not about faint BBC signals caught on coils hidden in latrines. Some veterans feared disclosure would dishonour the dead, those executed when radios were found. Others believed the public would not understand the risks. It was not until the 1960s, when oral history projects began in earnest, that these stories emerged. The U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency collected hundreds of interviews, many mentioning radios. One transcript from 1964 reads, "We built our set in a table leg. I never told my family until now. I thought they'd think me mad." Historians gradually recognized the pattern. Daniel L. Hallman's 2015 study, Killing Yamamoto, cross-referenced Operation Vengeance records with POW testimonies that confirmed early knowledge of Yamamoto's death. The convergence of sources left little doubt. Prisoners in the Pacific often knew before their captors. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's post-war interviews were revisited in the 1980s, revealing consistent prisoner claims of learning about Saipan, later Gulf, and the firebombing of Tokyo from clandestine sets. What once seemed anecdotal became documented fact. By the early 2000s, academic articles began framing POW radios as part of a larger story of resistance. Just as escape tunnels and sabotage had symbolized defiance in Europe, radios symbolized resistance in Asia. In New Orleans, the National World War II Museum mounted an exhibit in 2005 on Pacific captivity. In one case lay a coil of copper wire wrapped around a pencil stub, indistinguishable from debris, yet described in the placard as the beating heart of a prisoner-built receiver. Visitors lingered. Many leaned close, trying to imagine a faint BBC voice emerging from the scrap. Survivors who attended the opening ceremony wept quietly. The Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum paired a display of the P-38 Lightning, the aircraft that intercepted Yamamoto, with a prisoner's diary that recorded his death. "The news came through the wire," the diary read. The juxtaposition made clear: the weapon that struck and the secret radio that carried the echo. For decades, Japanese accounts barely mentioned POW radios. Captured officers in 1945 dismissed them as fantasies. But in later symposiums, candor crept in. At the 1962 US-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Tokyo, one former officer admitted, "If they had radios, then we underestimated them." It explains why morale never collapsed as we expected. By the 1980s, Japanese historians included POW radios in studies of camp life, acknowledging them as part of a larger underestimation of Allied prisoners. The shift reflected broader reconciliation, recognition that prisoners had resisted not just passively, but with skill and courage their captors had failed to imagine. At reunions, radios became touchstones of memory. At the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Honolulu, one session was devoted entirely to Voices Through Static. Survivors spoke of the first time they heard Yamamoto's death confirmed, of Saipan's fall, of MacArthur's return. For some, those memories were brighter than the day of liberation itself. "The gate opened in 1945, one veteran said, "but my freedom came the night I heard Normandy on the radio." The line drew applause, tears, and nods of recognition. Radios had given men liberation in spirit long before their bodies were free. Commemoration also brought acknowledgement of the cost. Names of those executed after discovery were read aloud at reunions. Veterans insisted that radios were not merely triumphs of ingenuity, but gambles paid for in blood. At a memorial ceremony in 1995, a plaque was unveiled listing prisoners executed for possession of contraband. Though the plaque did not specify radios, survivors knew. They spoke the names softly, ensuring they would not be forgotten. Historians today view POW radios as part of a broader narrative of how information sustains the human will. The Geneva Convention had been ignored, food was withheld, medicines scarce. Yet men improvised lifelines from wire and wood. The story underscores a paradox. Starving prisoners, denied the most basic human needs, still risked everything not for bread, but for truth. At the close of his life, Sergeant Walter Klein recorded one final testimony for the National World War II Museum. His voice was frail, but his memory sharp. "We had nothing, no weapons, no food, no freedom. But we had London's voice. Every night through crackle and static it came to us. It told us the world still fought, that we were not forgotten. That's why we lived. That's why I'm here speaking to you now." For Klein and for countless others, the whisper of forbidden radios was not just noise. It was a promise carried across oceans, wrapped in wire, hidden under floorboards, and it has never stopped echoing in memory. The radios prisoners built were not supposed to exist. Every inspection, every confiscated nail, every warning shouted by Japanese guards made it clear. Even the possession of wire could mean death. And yet, inside bamboo huts and beneath rotting floorboards, entire engineering schools seemed to reappear, improvised from memory, necessity, and scraps scavenged in secrecy. The first rule of survival was to see value where captors saw none. A discarded razor blade became a diode. A piece of pencil lead served as a resistor. Bed frame springs turned into crude antennas, stretched taut beneath thatch roofs. Survivors later spoke of walking the camp with a scavenger's eye. Every rusted nail, every broken flashlight, I asked myself, could this talk to London? One recalled in a 1978 interview for the US National Archives Oral History Program. The risks were constant. Japanese guards confiscated even kitchen knives. Yet prisoners risked everything for fragments of copper wire stripped from motor coils or snatched from workshop refuse. Few men had schematics. What they had instead were memories. Radio operators, electrical engineers, hobbyists, even a boy once tinkering with a crystal set in an Ohio basement pieced together designs by recall. In one Solomon Islands camp, a former Lockheed technician sketched a circuit diagram in the dirt with a stick. Others gathered around, nodding, erasing, correcting, their hunger momentarily forgotten. They argued over tuning coils and antenna length the way they once debated baseball. "None of us had manuals," recalled Lieutenant James O'Connor in a debriefing recorded by 13th Fighter Command in late 1945. "But the war had turned our minds into textbooks. We built from memory because we had nothing else. Among the most ingenious devices was a receiver hidden inside a toothpaste tube. Prisoners in Zentsuji Camp, Japan, hollowed out the metal casing, coiling fine wire within and attaching it to a tiny detector. The earphone, made from scavenged wire and a thin diaphragm of tin, fit into the palm of a hand. Guards who shook down huts never suspected that a tube of Lion brand toothpaste held the voice of the BBC. When news of Operation Vengeance crackled through that miniature set, the prisoners listening wept silently. Yamamoto was dead. Proof came not from rumour, but from London's voice slipping past the bars. The building was only half the challenge. Concealing the radios required as much creativity as their construction. Sets were hidden inside hollowed table legs, beneath latrine floorboards, in false-bottomed rice sacks. One group in the Philippines constructed a receiver within the shell of a broken clock. The clock face still ticked, powered by prisoners' careful winding, while inside, wires carried secret signals. Guards checked the time daily, never suspecting they stared directly at contraband. At Cabanatuan, a group buried their receiver beneath the camp's vegetable patch, running the antenna wire along a row of bean poles. They called it the Green Radio. Each harvest, they risked discovery as the wire was shifted to keep pace with growing plants. Every radio was communal. One man scavenged wire, another crafted earphones, a third stood lookout. The act of listening became a ritual of trust. News was never hoarded. Each word was memorized, then retold. Camp historians scrawled updates on scraps of paper, hiding them in canteens or Bible margins. "We all owned the radio," a survivor later explained. "Even if only one man heard, every man knew by nightfall." At night, stories spread like scripture. Yamamoto's death, the fall of Tarawa, the invasion of Normandy, all passed from mouth to mouth, transformed from static into hope. Discovery was constant threat. Japanese records recovered after the war confirmed dozens of executions linked to radios. The diary of the 4th Air Group noted in September 1943. "Prisoner executed for possession of wireless parts, necessary to discourage others. Yet executions did not stop the building. In fact, they spread determination. When they shot our friend for a coil of wire," one survivor recalled, "we swore his death would not silence us. We built another set within a week." Historians have catalogued the improbability. Without soldering irons, prisoners used resin scraped from trees or wax dripped from candles. Without insulated wire, they carefully twisted bare strands, spacing them apart on bamboo sticks. That such devices could detect shortwave broadcasts thousands of miles away remains astonishing. Yet U.S. strategic bombing survey interviews confirmed dozens of cases. Signals were faint, fading, often drowned in static. But to men behind barbed wire, a half-heard phrase from the BBC, "Yamamoto, downed, Solomons," carried more power than any feast. For historians, these devices blur the line between survival and resistance. No rifles were fired, no guards overthrown. And yet the act of listening defied captivity. It asserted autonomy. Daniel Hallman concluded in his study that POW radios sustained the will to survive by providing evidence that the war was not lost, that liberation was possible, and that the enemy's power was neither infinite nor eternal. The radios proved that prisoners were not passive. They fought not with bullets, but with circuits, fragile, hidden, alive with defiance. Years later, survivors often remembered not the hunger or disease, but the moment a faint signal broke through static. London calling, whispered through handmade headphones, and a hut of starving men sat straighter, eyes shining. Behind barbed wire, with death one careless discovery away, they had reached across oceans. They had pulled the world into their prison, using nothing but scrap and memory. The guards never expected it. The prisoners never forgot it. The prisoners never forgot the first time they heard the BBC in their hut. One man described it later. It was as if a door had opened in a locked room. In a camp where days blurred together in hunger, punishment, and disease, the radio became more than wires and batteries. It was the heartbeat of survival. Every night, men took turns guarding the hut as another crouched over the crude headphones. What they heard was rarely long. Fragments of speeches, a few casualty numbers, sometimes a scratchy bar of music before static swallowed the signal. Yet each word carried a weight far greater than food. The psychological impact was immediate. Men who had been wasting away with malaria or beriberi rallied when they learned that Guadalcanal had been secured, or that Rommel had been driven out of North Africa. A doctor in the camp later testified that patients who had given up began eating again when they believed victory was certain. Hope, it turned out, was a medical treatment. The news disciplined the camp in subtle ways. Men volunteered for work details, endured beatings without breaking, because they believed their ordeal had a purpose. Those who operated the radio became central figures, not commanders in the military sense, but custodians of morale. Every whispered briefing was delivered with ritual solemnity, as though reading scripture. Unknown to the guards, the prisoners often knew the wider course of the war more accurately than their captors. In one camp, a Japanese sergeant confidently announced in May 1943 that Tokyo had won a great victory. That same night, the BBC reported Yamamoto's death. Prisoners traded knowing looks. They realized the guard himself had been kept in the dark. After the war, interrogations of Japanese officers revealed genuine astonishment. At Rabaul, one lieutenant admitted, "The prisoners sometimes spoke as if they knew the fleet had been sunk before we did. We thought it was superstition. Only later did I understand they had radios." The flow of information shifted the balance of power inside the fence. Prisoners could no longer be reduced to voiceless captives. They were participants in a global war, even behind barbed wire. And in the darkest months of captivity, the faint whisper of London through static was proof that freedom had not been extinguished. When the war ended and the camps were liberated, the radios often vanished, dismantled by cautious hands, buried in the dirt, or left behind in burned huts. But the memory of them lived on in every man who had huddled to hear the BBC. In the decades after, survivors gathered at reunions, and inevitably the conversation returned to the nights of whispered news. At a 1962 symposium in Washington, a former POW described the radio as our weapon, though it fired no bullets. Another added, "We built no tunnels, staged no mass escapes, but with that radio we defied the enemy every single day." Historians later ranked the secret radios beside escape attempts at Colditz or sabotage missions in Europe. Though less visible, they carried equal symbolic weight. Building them was an act of defiance punishable by death. Operating them was a daily gamble. Preserving their secrecy was a collective oath of loyalty. Museums eventually enshrined this legacy. At the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, a small display case holds fragments of wire and a handmade earpiece recovered from a Pacific camp. The label explains that it once pulled news of the world through the night air to men who had almost forgotten what freedom sounded like. Visitors linger longer there than at racks of uniforms or weapons, because the crude device, more than any rifle, tells a story of human resilience. The oral histories preserved in the U.S. National Archives echo the same refrain. One former prisoner remembered hearing a BBC broadcast of a Glenn Miller song. "The tears came before I knew it. We weren't just prisoners anymore. We were Americans, still part of the world, and the world was winning." Even Japanese veterans, decades later, acknowledged their surprise. At a 1985 reunion in Hawaii, a former guard remarked privately to an American he had once overseen, "Now I understand why you never broke. You always knew something we did not." The legacy of the hidden wires was not simply about secret radios. It was about the will to resist annihilation through silence. Every turn of the tuning coil, every scrap of stolen wire, every whispered summary of news, these were acts of survival as vital as food or medicine. By the end of the war, most of the radios had been destroyed, but their echoes remained. In memoirs, in museum cases, in the memories of old men who once leaned close to hear a faint crackle of freedom. Behind barbed wire, stripped of weapons and liberty, they had built something greater than a machine. They had built hope,